thanks so much for being with us here this weekend. I know we've probably worn you out because you've been doing panels and all sorts of other bits and pieces, but it's so great to have you here. And as we're celebrating 25 years of the studio, I think it might be quite nice to sort of start off by going back 25 years to the point where, because you had all met, you were all students together, weren't you? But there's a sort of, I don't know, a lot of students have these kind of quite idealistic notions about let's club together, let's do a studio, let's do the, and obviously, you know, what goes from being something you talk about to actually doing is something quite different. But you actually did properly follow through with it and have now got this kind of huge success on your hands and maintained your independence, which I think is really crucial as well. Could I just ask you to perhaps just a little bit, perhaps between you, to tell us a little bit about how that kind of first started and how it went from being kind of a dream to reality, or a nightmare, perhaps, depending on how you look at it yourselves.
I think we kind of surprised ourselves that it kind of kept on going. I think we, you know, at the start it was something that we were going to do for a while and then go and get real jobs or something, you know. But Paul and I had registered the name because we were doing bits and pieces of jobs in college. There's a man here, Tomm Duffy, who I met on the bus in Dublin. I was drawing and he goes, "Are you an artist?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "I need someone to draw for my website I'm doing." And we worked with Tomm a bit in the early days, and Paul's brother-in-law gave us bits and pieces of jobs for doing the
stuff.
CD-ROMs for schools.
Back in the original internet bubble, when people did CD-ROMs and also flash cards, if you remember them, you used to send people birthday cards over email. That were like, and we made like maybe 6 or 7 a week.
Well, that was when the company kind of started up.
Yeah.
I think but back in college, you and Aidan Hart, you had sketchbooks full of ideas for this short film that was going to be about the creation of the Book of Kells. And we would all draw. We lived across the road from each other. You lived down the road. And so, but also I think you had a confidence coming from young Irish filmmakers in Kilkenny that we had nothing like that where we grew up. So I think that was.
I knew we had a shot. I knew we had a shot to do something. It was a bit naive, but still, we knew we could put something together in young Irish filmmakers, and that young Irish filmmakers in Kilkenny giving us that space within their building kind of allowed those two dreams to coalesce: the cartoon Saloon doing bits and pieces of jobs, and then this idea of making what became Secret of Kells. And so there was a gang of about 10 of us or so who were all in college together, and through Young Irish Filmmakers we'd organised a small kind of, it was the Millennium Arts and Culture Project it was called, and it was funding for artists, and it was a little bit more than the dole, but it was a lot for us, and it was kind of a way that we could continue the collaboration that we'd been having in college. And then we had like one building that we could all go into, which kind of meant something. It was like one place that we were going to.
One room with one computer.
Yeah, one room with one computer and loads of desks. And the story I always tell is we bought the animation desks from the Jimmy Murakami studio. He was doing the Teenage Turtles and things like that in Dublin. They were closing down because he was saying that 2D animation was over. So people were laughing at us buying all the old equipment to keep going with the 2D hand-drawn animation, you know.
That must have been quite a lucky thing then to have that opportunity to buy the equipment, because that would have been expensive. And
it was like a fire sale, though. You know, it's great.
We got a great deal.
And I mean, you talked about the fact that there was, you had this project which was a short film, and I think became potentially a TV special, which then became the film The Secret of Kells. And it was called something different at that time as well, I think, wasn't it? What was
Rebel.
It? Rebel, yeah. And the actual kind of the first project you delivered, though, I think was From Darkness, the first
Nora's
film.
First,
I mean, we, as Paul said, we had made these kind of flash cards, which you could do a little tiny beginning, middle, and end for like 30 seconds. You know, you'd make it in Adobe Flash or Macromedia Flash, I think it was called at the time. And we did commercials. We pitched for commercials. Paul would head up to Dublin quite a bit and try and remind the commercial studios that there was a company down in Kilkenny that would work all weekend to deliver a pitch for a Monday morning. But the Screen Ireland gave us our first opportunity to put something on 35mm film to make a beginning, middle, and end that was like 9 or 10 minutes, and that could then go out to an audience. It was premiered at the Galway Film Flag, got into competition in Annecy, and it was for us really mind blowing that you could make something that a wide audience could see. And so I suppose that was, I think short films is where we kind of cut our teeth.
And all three of you are clearly creative people. And when you look at the list of credits on that first film, all of you are very heavily involved in lots of different ways. But how did you kind of end up defining what your roles were going to be in those early days of the studio?
Yeah, that was very It's funny. I was joking.
Really
about this the other
organic,
day.
I'd say.
It's very organic. Yeah. I think myself and Tom. I always joke. I was sitting by the phone, so I kept answering the phone. So I became the producer instead of go. Okay, I'll come to see you then. Or so. But I kind of enjoyed that aspect of it too. We had like also friends like remember Desi McLaughlin.
Yeah,
Who helped
yeah.
us get computers. Who kind of friend of my father's. My father was a bank manager in the west of Ireland, and as a favour, he says, "I'll get your son hooked up with some computers for a lease." We still paid him,
Yeah.
but we were able to. He guaranteed a bank loan as well.
Right.
So he was kind of a big business angel. So he kind of got the gear to do those e-cards. And then Jerry, who is currently our managing director, was a great advice when myself and Tom went to visit some studios to ask
We did
for
little
advice.
tiny bits of other people's films
Yeah,
and stuff.
like a
little
co-producing,
few
like a
minutes,
feature.
yeah.
Yeah, and then Jerry says keep showing up to like Cartoon Movie, which was a brilliant event in Berlin. It still goes on, and basically what that is, if you have an idea for a film, we went with The Secret of Kells or Rebel at the time. Just go to those places, and we got to pitch it in front of a whole audience actually. But he encouraged to go to MIPCOM, all the TV markets, and we really had no idea. I remember me and Tom walking into the Palais and just saying, look at all this stuff, like because it's like TV everywhere,
Yeah.
and we were like, how are we ever going to make an impact? And so there was this level of optimism about, that stuff's okay, but we can do better than that.
Yeah,
And so
it's
it was
the
like if
naivety
they
of
were
youth,
able to
yeah.
make it, we might be able to make it. So it was an education, pretty much. In those marketplaces where suddenly you could be having a drink and you try to make friends with somebody and they'd say, oh, that's the person from the BBC over there, you should go and talk to them. So it was like just
I
general
think a big
networking.
thing for us as well was early on when we had the trailer for what was to become Secret of Kells ready. That became our calling card for all the work. That was our show reel. We were sending out VHS show reels, and then we kind of discovered the world of European co-production. So it meant a lot that our co-producers in France and Belgium believed, and it actually made people in Ireland take us more seriously. That co-producers in other countries were interested in working with us. So I think once we kind of found that European co-production network, that way of funding, we discovered a way to make features like almost like big long shorts, like they weren't like commercial endeavors to sell toys. They were like independent kind of art house animated films for families. So we kind of just found our way into that,
And
at
there's
a
very
certain time. Yeah.
It's a very healthy market in France. So we're
Yeah.
just becoming aware of like Didier Brunner,
Yeah.
who was our first co-producer. I met him literally on the bus on the way in saying, will you come to see our
And
pitch?
he's so highly regarded, isn't he?
Yeah, he was, and at that time he
I
was.
think
and
the triplets was what he was working on.
He produced a film called The Old Lady and the Pigeons, or La Ville Madame et les Pigeons, which I really loved, which I seen on Channel 4, and I said, oh, you did that. So I felt, if he likes that film, he'd be a good person to work with.
Yeah.
And then even the organizer said, he'd be really good to talk to. And literally, the lunchtime after the pitch, he says, I'd like to co-produce your movie.
Wow.
So that seemed very quick, actually.
Yeah, when you look
That
back,
doesn't
But he
happen
had to
every day of the
finish.
week.
But he'd
Yeah.
still finished the film he was doing, which was Belleville Rendezvous. And,
Yeah, the Belleville Rendezvous.
others, but he had made a success out of Kirikou and the Sorceress, which was the biggest kind of European animated movie at the time, and so people in Europe saw, there's a way to do this, and it was like, if you can make a film for under €7 million, was all the word that people were saying, you could probably just about get your money back, and you could just about make it by co-producing with France, co-producing with Luxembourg or Belgium or different countries who have their own funding structures to help. So then you put the work in those countries for them to get the money.
They had a lot more experience. I think Didier had maybe
Yeah.
20 years experience
yeah,
at that
yeah,
point. And
yeah.
so we were able to, because we were just all peers and we were just all learning on the job as we did it, we were able to then, because every co-production is kind of like a marriage, you could sink that company over there if you don't deliver what you're supposed to deliver on time. So, but they also then are invested in you doing well, and you are in them doing well. So we've been on both sides of that over the years, where we've been the ones with experience, and we were able to kind of shepherd younger studios, and vice versa. Then, so it's all this kind of companies learning from each other around Europe.
Coalition of the willing.
When I think about your studio, I think kind of quality obviously is kind of a given. Ethos, I think, feels very important, and I think sort of in integrity and independence as well. I guess to feel like they're very important to you, but not actually always important. Sorry, not always easy to kind of hang on to, especially in the current climate. And you talked yesterday when you were talking about the short films and the advertisements that you'd been making initially about the fact, obviously, from an ethos point of view, there were some advertisements that you wouldn't want to touch, even though they might have been lucrative. You did Greenpeace, but for very obvious reasons. Was that the case at the very start as well? Was that there, or did you have to take work that maybe you wouldn't have done later on?
Bit of both. I think we
Both,
said no
yeah.
at times for sure. Yeah.
There's like a famous story when we were barely paying the bills and we turned down a McDonald's commercial because of my sort of veganism and stuff. So
Should have taken it.
sorry. And there was, but then it was immediately followed up by an opportunity to make an earth share, like an environmental, so somehow we've managed to make it work over the years. But we got out of commercials relatively early because as a business it was changing, TV was changing. I think we'd grown up hearing stories of people here in London like Richard Williams and Oscar Grillo making their own projects on the back of commercials.
Yeah.
But that kind of golden age was fading. And so we were kind of at the end of that. So we only for the first 4 or 5 years did commercials and things like that. And then we started focusing more and more on trying to do our own projects or work for hire on other people's projects, but always TV or film or short
And
films.
it was both a kind of a curse and a blessing, being based in Kilkenny, where you couldn't really, compete with everybody who was trying to, compete for these commercials. But us being far away meant that we were able to kind of concentrate on our own work. So we just literally didn't have as many opportunities as you would have, and the pressures, the overheads that you would have in a bigger city, we didn't have down in Kilkenny. So it changed, exactly what we worked on, changed with that as well.
I guess the thing about animation is that you have still got those overheads, and unlike live action, it's very labour intensive. It's over a much longer period of time potentially until you get your return. And so I wonder whether times where you were approached by bigger companies to sort of take you over, or
There's probably times we would have wanted it.
Yeah, it's probably more that we would have. There was times when we would have loved that, but we were always kind of odd, I think, in that we were keeping going with stuff that wasn't the mainstream trend. Like even going with hand-drawn animation meant that the number of commercials that we could pitch for was always small, and there was a few other more established studios often going for them. And then when we were in between, like some of the big projects where we'd maybe overstretched ourselves and stuff like that, there would have been talk about like could we become part of another group or part of something, but it never happened. We kind of managed to always stay independent,
Yeah, we kind of backed away from anybody who felt like they would change the type of films that we worked on and the type of projects that we worked on. But we didn't have that. We never had the visibility of what we were going to be doing in 2 years' time. By the time we were looking for money, we might already be in trouble and all of that. It was actually when Jerry Sharon came and became part of the company that he started to give us that sense of, okay, well, this is what you're doing now, and this is, he really like put his shoulder to the wheel that already existed rather than trying to change the wheel, so that made a huge difference for us. It meant that we were able to kind of concentrate a bit more on what we were good at, without being fearful of, okay, well, maybe next month will be our last,
Yeah, like the first 10 years were fairly chaotic financially because we were all primarily creatives and pretty idealistic and putting everything back into the projects and stuff. And so then there was like a kind of a second era of Cartoon Saloon around Song of the Sea and Puff and Rock, the series, where I think we started to kind of grow up a bit and kind of become more of a business, yeah.
And now, if you look at the studio 25 years on as to what it is now, compared to what it was back when you started with that first computer and so forth, are there things that you would like to kind of, you would tell your old selves now in terms of about what they need to know and do and so forth?
I'd love to tell the younger Tom not to doubt so much, and to kind of stay the course because it really paid off. And there was often times when we'd be really worried, wasn't there? Like you'd be worried, can we keep doing this? Or are we going to have to go and get jobs somewhere in other studios? So I'm really glad that we always kind of managed between us. One of us was always optimistic enough to encourage the other two to keep going.
Yeah, but I would not say anything. I think especially with the Secret of Kells or sitting on the grass outside Ballyfermot school when we were looking at all of those drawings, I think I would say nothing to that young person, because you need a certain amount of naivety and absolute just force of will, like just not being able to fail, just wanting to push forward. So if I'd have said you really need a business plan, you kind of need some kind of financial backer here, and maybe in 15 years time, maybe then you can get to do your own stuff. the stuff that makes it might be sensible to me now, I just wouldn't. So even with, younger people that want to start their own businesses, or, I would be careful with that kind of advice, because nobody knows what you can really do. And certainly in animation film, nobody knows anything, as as they say. So yeah, I wouldn't say anything.
And believe in yourself, maybe, is all I'd say,
And Paul, in practical terms, what you had then was obviously a very small group of very dedicated, enthusiastic people. You were working together on like that short film. It's a relatively small number of people when you see the credits list, compared to what you have now, where you have hundreds of people. I guess you can scale up and scale down accordingly. What actually does the studio look like now? What in terms of people and size and so forth?
Actually, the size now is about 120. Is that right? And we'd have gone up. We do go up and down. I think our sweet spot is 150 to 200. And what happens is, when we did My Father's Dragon, for example, because we had all the money given to us, we didn't necessarily have to co-produce. We were able to grow a large amount of people in the studio. And then when we do things like co-productions like Song of the Sea or Wolfwalkers, we share the work out. So I think we did come to the conclusion we didn't want to be too big. We found it too much when we were like,
growth for the sake of growth wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
Like, it was more about finding a way to stabilize so we could tell the kind of stories we wanted to tell the way we wanted to.
Yeah. We didn't want it to become this unwieldy.
I'm still working on it, it's like it's like a shark. You have to keep swimming, like you never reach now we can relax. You're always trying to figure out, and the market changes and the environment changes, audiences change, audience expectations change. But I feel like we've been really lucky by being persistent with the stuff that we cared about and believed in. And sometimes I feel like it's crazy how it worked out that, at a certain point when Secret of Kells was released, a lot of people in the Academy and stuff in America were really happy to see that a hand-drawn feature was being made, and they were happy that they thought it was good, and like, you couldn't have told anyone a few years before that would have happened. You would have said that'll never happen,
To then get those Oscar nominations, which
it meant a lot,
where actually, in the industry in America, there was a whole set of lobbying firms who lobby on behalf of different films. And this suddenly was this little film that just suddenly came in. I mean, that's extraordinary, actually, isn't it?
Like we were saying, Jamie Bolio, who's an animation artist, was just passing out DVDs to friends. And I have another friend who's an animator. He went to Ballyfermot as well. He was an animator in Avatar, and he said it was like the buzz at the animation parties. People were talking about the movie and talking to each other about it. So it was so grassroots.
But you started an early blog as well. Like
the blog of Kells.
That was a huge thing, because people, you were blogging every day. Oh, we had a really hard production meeting today, and here's a sketch of it, for a film that's going to come out in 2 years' time.
Yeah.
But people, it really worked. Yeah, exactly. There was, people in Pixar on their lunch breaks checking the blog, and so it became
it was the blogosphere back in the early 2000s, before social media or anything, was a great way for artists to connect. And I had sort of started out on the message boards in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then everyone started having their own blog. And, friends that we work with to this day, like Jim Capobianco, was making his short film On the Side in Pixar, and he was blogging about that. And he would have got in touch with me. And, I kind of suddenly found that there was a way to connect to the people that before you would have seen their names in the art of books, or you would have imagined that they were sort of in an ivory tower or something. But everyone was very accessible and enthusiastic and excited to see what we were doing.
Very hospitable. Every time we went over there, really friendly. Like the animation industry all over the world is really embracing other artists.
Because we were hidden in a small town in middle of Ireland, a lot of them imagined that we were a much bigger organization or something than we were. So that was also to our advantage, because like everyone in Hollywood kind of knew each other, but then we were kind of arriving in just kind of almost out of nowhere, and they were like, who are these guys?
And actually, nice. You ended up partnering with some really major companies. I mean, there's Lucasfilm, there's Netflix, there's Apple TV, all huge companies. And I wonder whether that brings with it certain challenges when you're working with, without necessarily singling anybody out, but just when you're working with people of that kind of game, that they've got that much sort of money and power and so forth, whether that came with any kind of big challenges.
A lot of those partnerships came more recently, when we'd kind of established ourselves by doing the independent stuff. So a lot of the time, luckily, I mean, definitely on Wolfwalkers with Apple, for example, there was a kind of understanding what they were getting into. We were making the film anyway. And so I felt really lucky. We were really supportive. They wanted a cartoon saloon film, and I think, Paul, you had a similar experience.
Yeah, Lucasfilm sort of came to us. They said it was a very free brief. It was like, we want a cartoon saloon short. So what would you like to pitch us? So
Years ago, we were pitching Song of the Sea after Secret of Kells because we got the Oscar nomination. And in a way, we kind of wasted a year. Like, everyone was really nice, but everyone that we pitched it to said that we needed to make it CG or add songs, and they had a certain formula that they needed it to be. And they would often say very honestly, like, probably you won't want to, you know. And I remember saying to Paul, you'd nearly need to have an idea that you knew already was going to fit what they were looking for, because Song of the Sea was way too personal and indie and stuff. So in the end, we ended up doing it the co-production way. But we did spend a bit of time after the Oscar nomination for Kells going around the studios. And again, people were very upfront. Like, they would say, well, if you were to come here, you'd be in a kind of a loop of development, and it would have to be CG, and it would, you know. So, you know, we could see that it wasn't the way for us at the time, you know.
G-Kids distribution company in the US, back with the Secret of Kells, like, they were the first, you know, I don't know if we would have gotten distribution without G-Kids and in the US, and they absolutely were 100% behind the sensibility of the film and didn't try and make it into something or pretend it was something that it wasn't, or make a trailer that made it out to be something else. They really just embraced exactly what it was, and I think it was through the belief of, you know, G-Kids and similar distribution companies in different territories throughout the world that kind of made the larger companies then come and say, okay, well, you know, can you do what you do, rather than try and turn you into something else. Because I think a lot of smaller studios, even now, kind of will try and say, well, we're like a, you know, we can make a film that feels like a, you know, big studio film, whereas now you see from an artistic perspective, a lot of the big studio films are doing the opposite and trying to put the hand drawn into you know, into the work, and really kind of embracing that and the hand of the artist more. So it's funny to see how things kind of come around.
Yeah.
In terms of the Secret of Kells, when it had moved through the different stages and it was now you know, going to be a feature film, and at what point was that kind of fully kind of green lit, and had you started making the film already at that point? And
Yeah, we'd been kind of working on it on and off, and it had gone through different iterations. But then in 2005, the finance clicked into place between Ireland, Belgium, and it was really tough pulling it together and closing it. But I remember October 2005 going into Nora going, we've got the finance, shit, now we have to make it, you know, because then it was real.
We were already in it, right? Because
Yeah,
was
we
it
were
on Kells you came in, woo,
Hey, we're
and
fine.
we were like,
We were in the middle. Wait a minute, we weren't closed. Yeah, technically we weren't quite closed. But we're in it now. So, but we had lots of help from all of those other co-producers.
But I do remember that we moved out of Young Irish Filmmakers in October 2005. The TV series Kung Fu was kicking off. Secret of Kells was gearing up, and some crew, international crew, were starting to come and join the studio, and we were bursting at the seams in Young Irish Filmmakers, and we moved into our kind of HQ now in the Maltings in Kilkenny back then. So that was a grown-up moment for me, because I'd spent my whole teenagehood in Young Irish Filmmakers, and then this was like, now we're really doing something.
Yeah, learning about production pipeline software, using a proper edit kind of system, and all of that kind of grown-up stuff.
And there's kind of there's that balance, isn't there, between the kind of, you know, the Book of Kells itself and that visual style that you wanted to create, but still kind of having something that was kind of contemporary and going to speak to a kind of a contemporary audience, if you like. And you drew on lots of different. It wasn't all kind of 8th century Irish manuscripts you were drawing upon. You were drawing from sort of more modern sort of films and photography and art and stuff. I mean, how did that kind of I don't know whether you call them mood boards or what you'd say. What were the sort of the cultural influences on the film?
Oh, that first 5 years was like we were pumping all our, like we were learning how to, I always joke, we were learning how to tie our shoelaces practically, like how to run a studio, everything. But artistically, that was the project that was getting, you know, when we weren't working on a short or whatever and we were just doing work for hire, that was the project that was getting all our kind of inspiration pumped into it. And there was just so much stuff. And over the years it evolved. And even when DDA came on, he kind of had a big influence in encouraging us to go even further and be even more daring and go further away from a kind of Disney style to something uniquely our own. And I remember the first images that we did at the end of college, the DNA was in there. But then when you see the final film, it's quite different, you know, because it evolved. It was like we were learning about everything, from story to art direction to how to even get the thing made in those 5 years. So when I look back on it, it was a crazy kind of Precambrian explosion of designs and concepts and different directions and ideas and things that we wanted to do. And then kind of filter down into what we could do for Kells. And I feel like over the trilogy, some of those ideas from those crazy early post-college days were still feeding in all the way up to Wolfwalkers, like things that we'd wanted to experiment with back then were still feeding in all the way up to then.
There was something of the idea as well that we knew that we could control the design and all of the different influences between, like Richard Williams, from the Cobbler, Prince of the Eight-Headed Dragon, the Zagreb School of Animation, all this kind of, like, they all influenced over the years, but we always knew that the film was going to be divided up. It used to wreck my head thinking that, Brendan is going to walk out of one shot and into another shot, and there could be an animator in Kilkenny, another animator, in Hungary, and they'll never meet, they'll never talk about how does he walk, all of this kind of stuff. So trying to hold on to all of that information. And actually, I know it sounds mundane, but that production pipeline software was called Hubsoft at the time. That was huge as well, because it was a means by which you could communicate with an animator in Hungary and say, hey, we just approved this scene today, and now you can see it because you've got the next scene. So it goes up onto a web interface, and then they can see it. So we're working, we still work like that in ways.
It's good that you mentioned Hungary, actually, because the Hungarian folktales from the Kecskemét studio was one of the influences, because they had taken their indigenous folk art and done all these beautiful short films and animated them. And then my wife and I were on our honeymoon in Budapest, and we went to visit the Kecskemét animation studio, and it was kind of exciting for me to work with them down there. And I remember one of my favorite anecdotes from The Secret of Kells was they had a really brilliant cleanup supervisor, like doing the final line, and he was a Mongolian guy who had trained by painting on silk, so he had an amazing line. And the translator was this Transylvanian woman, Edith Sandor. And so I always remember having a conversation with a Mongolian guy via a Transylvanian translator about 9th century Irish monks and manuscripts, and the similarity between Irish manuscripts and Mongolian silk painting. So there you go.
That is the beauty of the European co-production, isn't it? You've got a bit of everybody in there. I'm going to just play our first clip if we can. We've got a clip from The Secret of Kells, just a short one, just to give you a bit of a flavour of what we're talking about. So let's watch that, please. Interesting for those of us who watched Wolfwalkers this afternoon to then see that earlier scene.
Yeah, the first wolves. Yeah.
I mean, when you look at that and think and look back to that that sort of first production, what is it you're thinking of when you see that clip?
Well, that was very much designed around the limitations that we were working with, and we wanted the wolves and in that to feel like the illuminations in the Book of Kells and stuff. So it's a very different approach to the wolves, I guess. But there's some similarities as well. And like I was saying, there's ideas that were around then, like having a scratchy line for the wolves that fell away because it was too hard to organise, that we brought back for Wolfwalkers.
And the actual Book of Kells itself resides in Trinity College in Dublin, has its own kind of keeper, so to speak.
Yeah.
And did you have access to the book, or did you go and visit the book?
That was a nice moment. Bernard, oh my gosh, I've forgotten his surname. Poor Bernard.
Bernard the keeper. Yeah.
He was the keeper of the book, which he
keeper
thought
of the
was a
book.
funny name. It sounded a bit like he was like, get back into the library. But he was in charge of the manuscripts in general, all the old manuscripts in Trinity College, and we met him early on, and he kind of gave us a little bit of advice, but I think he was a bit skeptical. And then we met him a couple of times during the production, but when he came to one of the first screenings that we had for the crew, he sat beside me, and I was kind of hoping that he'd like it, and he shook my hand and said, you did your homework. So I felt like we'd been. And then they offered actually to archive all the drawings in Trinity College. They took the paper drawings for the book.
So they're with the Book of Kells now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
safely.
That's an incredible thing,
They were
isn't
in
it?
great danger one Christmas. The papers from
Bernard Meehan.
Bernard Meehan. That's it. Bernard Meehan. They one Christmas, somebody left a tea bag in the sink, in the tap.
Oh, yeah.
And it was so funny because we were in the middle of this is the transition from digital to paper transition.
The water was switched off and the tap was turned on, but no water was coming out.
so
We
trouble.
all went home for Christmas,
And then
water came back on.
the water came back on and the tap was on, of course. So the drawings that were heading to Trinity College from The Secret of Kells were in front of the server room for Song of the Sea. So Song of the Sea was pretty much all digital. So the papers saved digitized rim, so the water soaked it, the paper soaked up the water,
And you could
it
actually see
didn't
for
fry
years the
server.
stain in the carpet in front of the computer room where and so the paper for Secret of Kells in Trinity College is probably all wrinkly and watermarked.
I mean, that's kind of gives it that sort of 8th century feel, doesn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
And I mean, you touched on Song of the Sea there, and we should probably move on to that. And you said that you spent quite a long time trying to get financing for it, and then went back through that kind of more established European model to kind of get the financing together. Did you, at that point, were you kind of self-consciously thinking about a kind of Celtic trilogy as it's become?
Yeah, I had the sort of notion there was a kind of wavering after Secret of Kells, because it was actually, you had to make Song of the Sea for a slightly smaller budget than Secret of Kells, because, I mean, for all the awards and everything, it had gathered to make Song of the Sea as independently as we wanted to. We were prepared to make it for a smaller budget with co-production kind of thing. But yeah, even then I had the idea, and I was lucky that there was still such a thing as physical media by the time Wolfwalkers was finished, just about, because I remember wanting a box set and having the idea of a box set. Even if I wasn't sure at the time what the third one would be, there was a few contenders for what it might be when Ross and I sat down to think about it. I remember thinking that while I was working on Secret of Kells, I had the idea for Song of the Sea. And so whenever I was frustrated with something on Secret of Kells, I was thinking, well, we'll get it right on Song of the Sea. And I had the idea for Wolfwalkers before Song of the Sea started production. So all through Song of the Sea, Ross and I would be talking about, well, I wish we could do this. We will do it on, so it was kind of like each one we were learning what we wanted to do for the next one,
And were you self-consciously moving younger in terms of the age group? I mean, obviously, there are films that are appreciated by all ages, but it's definitely got a sort of, it's easier and more accessible for younger audiences.
For Song of the Sea?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really conscious. Yeah. It was really, and we kind of learned so much on Secret of Kells about tone and audience, and, it was a very, like, the touchstone for Song of the Sea was much more like something like Totoro, or there's an Irish film called Into the West that I really took a lot of inspiration from as well.
But it is a film that deals with loss. I think Kells was always going to, in the climax, have a burning monastery, where some sacrifice, involved. And there's sacrifice in Song of the Sea as well. It's just and in ways that can be more scary and personal, the kind of thing.
I found it amazing that parents and adults would find Song of the Sea heart-wrenching in a way that some of the kids didn't. And then vice versa sometimes. It was really interesting what different, it really seemed to play to different audiences at different levels.
Yeah, and I know, like, there was just a relative of mine, when she was young, she used to just during the summer every morning have to start every day with watching Song of the Sea, just really for some moments in her life, just really kind of struck with her. But I mean, that's the thing, and I suppose I don't know whether it was a really conscious decision or something that just was coming, from us anyway, as a group of collaborators and filmmakers, just wanting to tell stories that didn't pull punches, but didn't, punch for the sake of punching either. Like, just said, okay, life can be complex, and then, we as kind of responsible storytellers want to give you a companion through, some of the more sometimes challenging times in your life. But we were also, the wonderful thing about scripting and storyboarding and the collaborators we've had with our screenwriters and with our storyboard teams and our heads of story is that they're so invested in layering stories where you might have something really complex going on, with Brona, the mother character in Song of the Sea. But you just, putting that humor in there, that relationship between, two siblings that don't particularly get along. All of that was stuff that we could layer in there so that if you're ready for it, you'll see it. But if you're not, you probably won't, not on first viewing.
And I think that touches on what we were saying before about the fact that there are kind of messages in these films, but then I guess you're using kind of the devices of the Celtic tale or the Irish folklore as your kind of framework to tell those stories.
What I used to talk about a lot was that those stories can kind of be metaphors for different things. And you kind of are distilling down what's the truth in the story that resonates for you for this version of it. And it could be retold with a different, but for me, the Selkie story seemed to have something about grief and a few different strands. Whether it was just the loss of the stories themselves and the connection to the authentic kind of traditions that had become a bit commercialized or something, I thought at the time. Or just the actual family, the human family story was in there. But that seemed to be in the stories. When I read a book called The People of the Sea during Secret of Kells. Ross, my co-director, and Wolfwalkers gave it to me. And it seemed to me, reading through it, they had been collected in the 1920s. up and down the west coast and in Scotland. And it seemed to me that, at least in my reading of it, where I was coming from at that time, they all seemed to be about dealing with loss, in different ways. So that seemed like to be the theme in the Selkie stories.
And I don't in London. So I was going to say that there's a Secret of Roninnis, the John Sayles film, which some people might have seen, which tells a sort of a live action sort of Selkie story, and then you have your animated story. Are Selkies kind of known in Ireland? Would you assume that the average person on the street would know about a Selkie?
There's another theme in it that, right, my son, like me, was all into like American media and comic books and Japanese animation and stuff like that. And I based the main character in Song of the Sea on him, on Ben, because when I had the idea, it was at the very start of Secret of Kells. We were on holidays in the west of Ireland, and I realised that the stories that were in the touristy shops were not really appealing to his generation. They were sort of in it for a different way. So I kind of wanted it to be, in a way, reinvigorating those stories in a way for the next generation, and then they'll remember them and tell them again in another way, so that they don't become just sort of curiosities in kind of history books, but they're actually a living folklore.
So at the time, there probably wasn't that many people who really knew about Selkies, or were aware.
It wasn't in the like that was part of the inspiration. Was I saw, and it's a bit dark to share, but we were on the beach in Dingle in the west of Ireland, and there was seals that had been killed by the fishermen, and they've been blaming the seals on stealing the fish, and the fish dog. There's a whole problem going on, and we were renting a cottage from this lady, and we talked about it because my son had been a bit disturbed. He was about 10 at the time, by seeing the seals, and she was the one who said it to me, that in the old days they would have believed. She said to me that the seals would have the souls of people who died at sea in them. Now, she didn't say Selkies, but it kind of set me off, kind of going, yeah, there was these. And then I talked to Ross about it, and he gave me the book, and so it was like a little remnant of it as a oral tradition in a way, and she said that wouldn't have happened in the old days, that this fishermen wouldn't have killed seals like that in the old days, and she said
would have
it
been
was
superstitious. So in a way, the stories were protecting the seals, in a sense.
Yeah,
like
or there was a connection to the landscape and to nature and to the environment, that the stories kind of, the beliefs, those folk beliefs kind of made people feel more part of it, not separate from it or something.
There's still, we just passed one the other day, and Robin was asking me on the way in the car, my daughter, so what's that over there? And it was like what we would call fairy forts in Ireland.
Oh yeah, the fairy forts.
There are probably similar things in the UK, I don't know, but where like farmers wouldn't go near a certain part of the field. Like if there was supposedly a fairy fort in here, which is usually a crop of trees, maybe hawthorn, maybe there's some standing stones, they will leave it alone because they don't want to be cursed by like there's still this lingering. And now it's become, well, let's leave it the way it is. It's still lovely to have a fairy. But back in the day, they wouldn't have gone near it. They wouldn't farmed over it because for fear of, disturbing the fairies or being cursed.
There's like a big, massive theme in the trilogy that I think is still important about that kind of, and it's in Miyazaki's work as well, that kind of re-enchantment with nature, that you kind of see nature in a different way rather than as a commodity to be plundered or to be used, but actually as something almost an animist way of looking at it, and I think that runs through the trilogy, and I think it just gets more and more important, sadly, every year, that we need to kind of reimagine our relationship to the natural world.
I always think that sort of in the same way that Ghibli is to Japan, I always think of you being to Ireland in a sense, because not just in terms of the environmental messaging and so forth, but actually just in the fact that you're telling very Irish stories, but they are with such global messages that actually people around the world engage with them and find them so fascinating. And when you're thinking about your audiences, are you thinking about your kind of home audience first, or does that not really come into it?
I think you just naturally do because it's where you're from, but you're always thinking as well, will this have a universality? Will this be understood? And I guess what I loved about, say Totoro, for example, there's loads of details in that I wouldn't know about just Japanese everyday life in the 1950s. And I just loved that. That was interesting to me. But the story, the kids, everything was universal. So you're always looking for that blend, I suppose.
And in animation terms, anything that deals with the sea is always something that most people would really have a big think about before they make that decision to go down that route, because it's notoriously difficult to animate, isn't it?
Yeah, should have thought more about it actually.
Well, you had in Jeremy Purcell, who went to college with us in Ballyfermot, had a real love of effects animation, and he was a great collaborator, and just solution orientated, but also just really understood by keeping the design strong, then then you could be really clever about how you use your effects. And then Sir Jume as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, the team, like when we were dealing with trying to figure out how to do the sea, there was a lot of experimenting early on because we knew we couldn't afford, even Ponyo was fully hand animated and we couldn't do that. We knew we wouldn't be able to. So we had to come up with clever solutions where we'd animate individual waves and then layer them up in the computer. So it was a real kind of, like a lot of our work ends up being a kind of a collage of different techniques in order to make something. And as Nora says, if you design it well, nobody will ever even notice. And it almost becomes more interesting than if you'd done it like, if you'd had a $1 billion budget to do it really realistically, because you're designing solutions to the budget restrictions, I suppose, and then the design becomes beautiful in itself.
And despite you turning down the opportunity to make the film as a kind of musical Disney-esque sort of CG film, there is a musical moment that we're going to watch now from the Song of the Sea, which involves a Selkie song.
Yeah.
Shall we watch Song of the Sea, please?
That was a good example of like that whole film was very co-developed with the music, because that was really talky for a while. Do you remember there was a lot of exposition and it was kind of boring in the storyboards, and then we had the idea of making it more like a song, so the information was in the song, which made perfect sense for the movie, But the other thing I always remember about the music for that was that we would have had a lot of like flashbacks to the mother character. And early on, Bruno had the idea of like recording Lisa Hannigan, who sang the main Song of the Sea and was the mum character. And just her vocals through the score allowed us not to have to show visually every time Ben was thinking of her. She kind of was present just in the music. And actually the whole film, some of the inspiration, there's a tune, like the Song of the Sea tune was on an unreleased Keela album that they shared with us. And I was listening to it in the car driving in and out and daydreaming about the movie. I think Nora pointed out to me that was Kissing Gay, it was Dee's tune.
Yeah.
And so it was funny, it was all kind
We
of...
used it for a little clip for the, the little trailer, the inspiration trip. Actually, that brings back a couple of nightmares. I remember because Colm Snuddig from Keela, they had done us a demo for it so that we could cut to it in the in the storyboard, and then in animation it looked like, okay, the characters don't have enough time to go from A to B, and so can we have a few frames, which is usually not a problem. But when you're already animating them to a rhythm, you can't just give a few frames. You have to give it exactly like a beat, kind of. And it was just wrecking my head completely. And then I remember, I just remember at one point, Colm saying it was giving him the heebie-jeebies or something like that. He just couldn't actually listen to it anymore because we were trying to get the right amount of beats, and something that looked like it was a whole heap of fun was not a whole heap of fun. Yeah, at one point to try and get the rhythm into it. But
Paul, I know that obviously with this film you had Jerry sort of increasingly working with you. Did that then sort of free you up to kind of, I mean, I know you're a creative producer anyway, but be a bit more creative than perhaps you were starting to find yourself if you were having to be the sort of the money man?
Well, I wasn't really. It was along this time while a production is going on. My main job after something was started or something was queued off, I would often, purely for my own pleasure, join the guys when they're doing voiceovers or join in the music side of things. But generally speaking, when something was in production, I was trying to line up the next things.
Yeah.
And we would have a slate of things maybe for television, like even Puff and Rock or other things, or Skunk Fu back in the day. So I was trying to figure out what the next thing might slot into place afterwards. So continuing to do that with Jerry then, and going out to all the markets as usual and talking to people. And then Breadwinner came around. Was that right? After Song of the Sea and for example, so things like that. I'd be off on trips with, like, let's say Jerry or something like that, and you're looking for the next project. So Breadwinner came to our hands as a kind of book, and I thought, and me and Jerry would talk to the producer there, Anthony Leo, who bought the rights to it, and says, maybe this would be interesting, this Nora's next project or something. So we took it to Nora, but just to try to come up with, you can see the road running out, but as the production starts to finish, we need something else.
So the ideal is to try and move a group of people from one production onto another.
Yeah, so ideally, it's worked out sometimes. It does work out sometimes. And I think with Song of the Sea, when the pre-production team finished up there, I think we're nearly ready for the pre-production to go into Breadwinner, or maybe I'm getting that wrong. Breadwinner to Wolfwalkers was probably one of the nicest.
That was nice, yeah, because Ross and I had a lot of time to develop Wolfwalkers while Breadwinner was in production.
Yeah.
And we inherited a lot of the team that Nora had trained up, and then, that was more... Yeah.
you're trying to get so you have a pre-production team, and we're really good people. You don't want to lose, or you want them to stick around. And so then you want, when they finish up pre-production, like storyboarding and all that, and design and layout even, you want them to be able to roll into the next one. Sometimes they have about a 2 or 3 month gap that they might want to take anyway on holidays after we go.
And we're always running TV projects and other small, like during making the Song of the Sea, Ross and I were doing a little segment of The Prophet, which was had lots of different chapters, and there was always kind of different things. As Paul says, you have to have a few projects running kind of at the same time.
The sweet spot we're always trying to figure out is about 3. If you have 3 things in production, you don't risk the large gap between 2.
Yeah.
And so as a minimum, it's almost, and then at one point we had nearly 4 or 5 things in production.
Yeah.
We didn't like that. That was just
I
too
mean,
much.
you just touched on The Prophet then, but there have been a few films where you've provided some expertise in. I mean, I'm thinking about, we had Mamoru Hosoda here with his film Belle, and I know that's a film that Cartoon Saloon had a hand in, and I think even it's the Bob's Burger movie.
Oh, that was in Lighthouse, yeah.
That was so Lighthouse is your Canadian studio.
It's kind of like a sister studio. It's a partnership with Canadian company Mercury Filmworks. They're also in Kilkenny, and we're kind of we co-own it, but we also were a big part of getting it started because we wanted to have a bigger base in Kilkenny for artists to be able to work in between the 2 studios. Because when it was just Cartoon Saloon, if we had a slow period, people disappeared away again, so it was good to have another studio in town. And they did a lot of lovely work on Bob's
Burgers, not the most vegan project.
Not a very vegan project.
And but those little, like with Belle is I think the one I'm most interested in, because
that was kind of a guest star spot. Kind of, it was really nice to be asked, and that was around the end of Wolfwalkers, and Ross and myself and a couple of the main kind of background artists, we did some designs for the world in between. There was kind of a fairy tale world, a misty world in between the big internet kind of world and the real world. And we did some, actually Almu, who just won the Emmy for Screecher's Reach, some of her concepts made it almost pure onto screen, but we didn't know how much he was going to use. Like, we did this work, and he gave us storyboards as a rough guide and references, and we provided a lot of stuff, and then he used as he needed for the film. So when I saw the film at the premiere in Paris, I was like, oh, they used that bit. Oh, well, that's great.
Oh, that's fascinating though. It was right until the end as well.
Yeah.
And the projects you've been talking about have been very unique projects that you've either devised or worked with, with writers and stuff. But with the 2 films, the 2 features that Nora, you've directed, both of those have got a kind of an original sort of book or something for you that's been adapted. And I wonder, when that happens, what your kind of sense of, whether there's a big sense of responsibility, if you like, when you're taking something that's kind of loved and known and then having to make it into a film, which by nature is always going to have differences.
Yeah, there is. I on both occasions, say with the Breadwinner, Deborah Ellis had written a draft of the script before Anita Duran, the screenwriter, became involved. So we talked to Deborah, but also talked to her about how the political situation in Afghanistan had changed by the time that we started making the film, and the changes that we would want to make. But she was she had such an aligned sensibility and is such a generous soul. She kind of stepped back after that first draft, so and let Anita really kind of take the lead on it. And then with My Father's Dragon, Julie Lynn and Bonnie Curtis of Aircraft Pictures. We met them ages ago.
Mockingbird?
Sorry, what did I call them? Aircraft. Oh yeah, no, that's the Breadwinner. They had to come to us years and years ago, like back 2012 or something like that, and it kind of went into the background for a while and then came back. And when we were doing other things, Meg LaFauve, the screenwriter who also was a screenwriter for Inside Out, she had read the book as a child, as had Julie Lynn, and it's an interesting thing to adapt something that's the original book of My Father's Dragon is quite young, so Meg really wanted to age it up, as did Netflix, I think. So so trying to find a story that kind of both honored the original relationship between Elmer and Boris, and then but also kind of added an element of kind of drama to the feature was an interesting kind of challenge.
And in the Breadwinner, once again, I mean, the messages are very clear in there, and obviously that they are all based on truth and, a kind of regime that existed then and still exists in a sort of different format, but with the same name now. And I guess from an animation point of view and from telling the story point of view, a lot of it is about some of those sort of smaller moments and those sort of silences and allowing the characters really to kind of breathe in that very kind of brutal terrain. And I think what's so fascinating, I think, about the Breadwinner is the fact that they're very real, plausible characters who have to behave in different ways behind closed doors, and they're allowed to outside of that. And I wonder whether you just tell us a little bit about drawing on real life like that and making those characters real and alive. I guess that's what's so important for us to know here, that actually just, a plane ride away, there are people who have to behave in completely different ways.
Well, it's interesting because I remember when the Breadwinner came out, there was some debate about historically speaking, what exactly the restrictions on women were, and now we're seeing, back again where women are not allowed in public places. And rights and access to education is something that's also, not something that anybody can take for granted, but it's quite visible. Again, the lack of equality that's there. But we always wanted to make sure that rather than a really worthy and messagey film, that this was a film about real people who had real flaws, and that weren't, the focus on that central family and the dynamics within the family is something that we can all identify with, and that was really important to everybody working on the film. I remember Kawada, who voices Razak in the film, he really wanted to bring a sense of kind of compassion and humanity to the character of Razak, even though he plays a member of the Taliban who is quite a complicated and conflicted, set of wants within his within the person that he is, and how his relationship with Parvana and how she changes his behavior, but not in any kind of like superhero type way or in any way that's going to kind of change the world, but in a small actions, and how I guess the film is really a film of small actions and how they can have a transformative effect on a lot of people. And I think that everybody who was involved in that film, whether it was Angelina Jolie or Kawa or a lot of people who just really wanted to tell the story the right way. It was really uncanny to me how it all kind of aligned, that everybody was nodding at the same things. Nobody wanted to make a completely different film or anything like that. I think everybody who became involved in that film did so for the right reasons, and to shine a light on young girls like Parvana and her human rights, and how they can be taken away in a way that that even she would have to be reminded that she has an entitlement to an education, she has an entitlement to a voice, she has an entitlement to be her own creative self without somebody taking that away from her.
I think it would be good now to have a look at a clip. So could we watch a clip from The Breadwinner, please? I mean, it's such an interesting clip, not just because of kind of the way it sort of sets everything up so beautifully, and obviously the hardships at which we're, you see it go from the sort of the joyous moment at the very start, then through in that very short period, but also in terms of the animation decisions you made, the different styles of animation you use in that one very short clip.
Yeah, we I suppose originally had been looking at cutout for in terms of showing Parvana's imagination, because again, a character like Parvana, I remember when I came to the project initially, I was kind of thinking, okay, well, how do we show like maybe her frustration about not being able to express herself maybe in the way that she could, and speaking with like people like Shaisi Latif and who voices Soraya, she was saying that she wouldn't, you're thinking of it too much in a Western way, and that she wouldn't express herself in that way, and she might never really tell you how she's feeling or what she's really thinking. So, but we wanted to give her a sense of freedom and the idea that nobody can take your imagination away from you. And so we were looking at cutout animation. We did some tests, which were really beautiful, but we felt that just to do it for the entire feature, or for the imagination sequences for the feature, and where we were going to take it eventually, it kind of wasn't our expertise in Cartoon Saloon. We worked with Guru Studios in Canada to, and Jeremy Purcell, actually, who I mentioned earlier on as well, helped direct those sequences where we see her imagination. We rigged them. They were, broken into hundreds of layers, and then we composited them in Nuke with our partner studio in Guru in Canada. Kind of helped them look the way that they do, and so then between the two worlds, then we found a kind of a balance between her imagination and then just the real world of Kabul as well.
And you mentioned earlier Angelina Jolie, who has an executive producer credit on the film. Was that very much about her putting her name on it to kind of endorse and promote, or did she have a wider role?
No, she came on quite early and gave me access to some advisors just to find, to make sure that we were staying with the right sensibility and the right tone, and that we were also mindful of the political situation in Afghanistan at the time when we were making the film, and just that we use the opportunity to tell the story as subtly and with as much wisdom as we possibly could. And so throughout the process, then she would, watch the animatics and just give advice, and then kind of open some doors for me in terms of like people that I could talk to, so that we got the tone of everything, as best we could.
And then moving on to My Father's Dragon, as a mother of two boys, was that a good way in for you in terms of the relationship between the sort of two male protagonists? Like, obviously one is Boris, who's a dragon, and the other is a boy. But did that help in some respects?
Yeah, absolutely. The My Father's Dragon really, and I think it's the same with Ruth's book. It's not really a boy and his pet. It's not one of those, kind of like Black Beauty kind of story. It's more, there are two kids. One just happens to be a dragon, and they're both dealing with fear in different ways. I do have two boys, and we had moved house, and every now and again they would ask me, but why did we have to move? And I would say, well, there was mushrooms growing out the wall of the old house. It probably wasn't the most healthy place, but no matter what I would say to them, it just didn't make emotional sense to them. That was their home, and I, taken them away from their home, and we had a new home, but they had such an emotional connection with where they were. And so Elmer in My Father's Dragon, is his mom, takes him. They have to move away from where he feels secure, and he has to reroute himself someplace else, and that makes him quite scared, and that his reaction to that is to try and control things, and his mom, I really identified with as well, doesn't say the right things at the right time. I love that she's not a feisty, fantastic, octopus-handed mother that can do everything and be everything to everyone. She messes up, and that causes a kind of growth spurt in Elmer. He kind of changes because of that. And then the interaction between he and Boris, their relationship with Boris is also kind of afraid. Even the opportunity to put two kids, boys, on the screen, and they're kind of afraid. That was something that was a challenge that I relished. They weren't superheroes. They weren't going to change the world. They were just going to find a bit of strength in each other by just allowing each other be, who they are.
And we were talking earlier today with Tomm about Wolfwalkers, and the fact that, I guess there must have been some moments in tandem between the two productions, but your production of Wolfwalkers was ending as the pandemic was kind of starting. You were in your last stages, but it must have hit this production a bit more, did it? It was in full lockdown during the production, and we had a lot of people working on the project. It was quite different from the other projects in that we weren't dealing with our kind of smaller budget, low, independent production model. We were dealing with, I think money was the one thing we did have,
Yeah.
and as many people as we could, but we didn't have time, and we couldn't put everybody in the one room, so it was really challenging. It was good in ways. I always remember when we would have meetings, somebody would bring up a piece of reference, or they'd want to talk about something, and they just put it up on the screen. It was so economic from that perspective in terms of communication. But then if somebody wasn't feeling great. You didn't see it. You didn't see it in the hunch of their shoulders. You were just looking at somebody on a screen. Sometimes you were looking at 30 people on a screen. So it's not that same dynamic where, even if you have a question to ask, if you're a part of an animation team and you miss something that happened in the meeting or something was really confusing you, in real life, you would that person would come up to you afterwards and go, I really didn't get this, and you go, oh my God, you're right, and then you pull everyone back into the meeting. On a screen that doesn't quite work that way. So yeah.
And Tomm, do you have a kind of equivalent of, like Pixar's Brains Trust or sort of Disney's kind of creative leadership group, where when there's a production going on, like say you're working on Wolfwalkers or Nora's working on My Father's Dragon, I know that you all kind of work on each other's projects to an extent, but do you have a sort of a group like that sort of sits and looks at where things are at, and as a sort of, or is it actually just a lot more organic?
It's pretty organic, but at different times there's friends in the industry who don't work with us consistently, but that come in at certain points, and then there's people within the studio besides Nora and Paul that I'd really respect their feedback. But one thing I did on all three of the films was my wife was a primary school teacher for 22 years, and she was teaching like 8-9-year-olds, so we'd show them the first rough draft animatic more than once. Like,
they can be brutal.
Yeah, and they'd be really honest, and it was great. Like they would all, because it would be just storyboards, you'd always get one note back saying you should color it in.
Yeah.
It's really helpful. But also, no, it was really interesting to sit and watch them watching it and see where they were engaged and where they weren't engaged. And I was in the privileged position, like I wasn't obliged to change anything, but I wanted to know that the young audience, that was the first audience I was thinking of, would enjoy the films, and where they would be engaged and where they might lose interest was really important to me. And then like amazing friends in the business, like Jim Capobianco, who I mentioned earlier. Darren Holmes is a great editor who's worked with us. I met him when I first joined the Academy. There was like a little party, a little soiree in the Academy building in LA, and I heard a really strong Irish accent, and it was Rosaline, Darren's wife, and she introduced herself to me saying, you're from Ireland as well. And they happened to have a house in Kilkenny, a holiday home, and he had edited like Kung Fu Panda and How to Train Your Dragon, all these great movies. And he ended up coming in as a great consultant and working with our in-house editors a lot. So people like that, we've been really lucky, yeah.
I mean, this might seem like a strange question in a sense, but sometimes when you've got a smaller budget, I think it forces you to be more creative almost, because you have to think about how you're going to get to your end result without having to spend the money. But when you've got a bigger budget, as you did with Dragon, is there a downside to that as well, or is it just the money's there, we can just put it in?
I think when you're making a co-production, I think the director really is king, because you're dealing with oftentimes like a lot of small companies. We choose really carefully with Jerry who we work with, and we have a lot of recurring relationships. And those companies are really invested in you doing well and the director doing well, and that the best shot that the film has is that it's a director's vision. I think that's something that's really and I think that's something that is really valued in European co-productions. And even when we worked with Aircraft in Canada, like there's not a huge feature industry in Canada, and there's so much talent there. It's a really amazing, but they get a lot of service work from the States. But I'd love, sometime in the future to see a lot more feature films coming from Canada in the animation space. It's a different set of challenges, but I learned so much from working with Meg LaFauve, who I don't think I would have had an opportunity to work with otherwise. I got to work with an incredible, cast as well.
I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? I guess because you've worked with Brendan Gleeson and Sean Bean, and they're kind of real titans in the industry. But this was a very Hollywood cast you had access to, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But working with amazing young people like Gaten Matarazzo, for me, who was from Stranger Things.
He's so great as the Dragon.
He's just incredible. But he's a filmmaker himself. I remember the first time I met him, he came, with the script and had some really great questions about the script. He's got a writer's head and a writer's heart. So working with him and Jacob in the room, for me, I think you were there as well. Yeah, there was incredible electricity between them, and that's a real privilege to watch. When you're as a director, voice directing, and you're in tears yourself because your actors are just, they don't have. It's lovely to work with really raw talent as well, but oftentimes the confidence to be able to give it your all in a space that in a kind of trusted space of a recording studio, that can be really difficult. I remember even with Lisa Hannigan, with who did a beautiful job in Song of the Sea as Brona, the mother. I remember I could just see her hair and the microphone. She was so she just wanted to make her own little kind of trusted little space, but with people like Jacob and Gayton, they're so experienced that once you create that space for them, they will fully utilize it, and from take one, which is, for me, I just was able to sit back and listen to them then.
We're gonna play our final clip, which is My Father's Dragon. If we could play that one now, please. I love the fact that you've got that sort of at the start of the film. There's the Nevergreen City, which is very noiry and very kind of dark, and then you suddenly got this explosion of kind of colours. And in the book, I think there's a map that's kind of laid out, but you still then have to kind of create and animate and colour these new worlds within the island. I mean, that's quite a big challenge in terms of how much you've got to put in and how much time you would have probably had to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, because it had been such a long time, I guess, since we were first kind of approached by Julie and Bonnie, and it had gone through. I know, Tomm, you had done work, and especially I think during the Breadwinner and afterwards, and then Anya McGuinness came on as the art director, and yeah, I mean the wonderful imagination of the crew. This is the thing. I mean, as a director, when you're dealing with art directors like Anya, and you've got a lot of location designers that are really all putting their kind of brain power to it and their whole imaginations. Like every film is not just it's the imagination of like 200 people all brought together, and they're each with their own expertise, and everybody wanting the film to be as beautiful or as imaginative or as engaging as it can be. So when you get to work with people like that, it makes things easier for sure.
And there was a feature last year made of Puffin Rock, which obviously started its life as a TV show and continues, to this day. I mean, it's been a massive success, the show. Was it the two of you who created the show? Am I right? Or what's your involvement?
I'll tell you the original idea. We should mention Lily Bernard, who was a really important part of it. But the original idea for Puffin Rock was the same trip where we saw the Dead Seals. We were going out to Skellig Faheel, which is now Luke Skywalker's hideaway to the world.
Yeah.
Back then,
where the Porgs live.
Nobody outside of Ireland knew about it. And on the way out to Skellig Faheel on the boat, there's Puffin Rock. There's an island that's just for puffins and other seabirds. It's a sanctuary.
Is it called Puffin Rock?
Yeah, it was called the Puffin's Rock or something close to that. And my son was about 10 at the time, and he was mad into like nature documentaries and David Attenborough stuff. So equally, he would watch nature documentaries or Cartoon Network. And he was fascinated by this island that we weren't allowed to go to because no humans were allowed on it. And that was the germ of it, So like, I'm still making the argument that I should be sent on more holidays to County Kerry to come up with ideas. Song of the Sea and Puffin Rock both came from that same week or two down there. But then it came back, and Lily was one of the background artists on Secret of Kells, and she really saw something in it and came up with some, like I'd done some preliminary character designs and stuff, but she really expanded it out and developed it and really came up with the look. And then Paulie came in big time on the stories and developed.
I think I was doing a preschool script writing course and then used that as a go of doing. I think I did a little story about a little sea otter. It was very cute. I don't think it ever made it to the series, losing his stone.
Still time. The third
still
season.
Time. Yeah. Still time for a sea otter with losing his stone. But and then we had pals in Derry. There was a very good Laura Campbell who I'd met, which was a very good script development person in UK here. And she had started a company in Derry with her old friends, Dog Ears. And they suggested we try to publish it as a book as well first. Mm-hmm. And that drew the attention. What was really interesting actually as a way to launch a project is like, if you actually make something, even if you only print the one book, when we went to pitch to broadcasters, they said, "Oh, this is a real thing." It's like an app. But we just made a book to look like a picture book, but it felt very real to them. And even then, and so we tried to put some money together between a few broadcasters. Then Penguin came on board. They says, "No, don't self-publish that book. We'll publish the book." So, but they also invested in the TV series, which was a fairly unique deal at the time, where they were investing as a book and invested into actually the TV series as well. So they became a third partner, and that's how it kind of kicked off. Then wonderful then directors and team then took over.
I think the work you did with Laura and Nora as well kind of brought it from my original idea, which was like a child David Attenborough, just talking about what's happening to them, actually having character and personality. And then, of course, since the first season, Jeremy's been and Lorraine have been a huge part of it. Maurice Joyce was the director of the first couple of seasons, but Jeremy and Lorraine did the feature, and now they're into the third season.
There's a big difference, though, isn't there, between making a short episodic TV show for kind of preschool kids and then making a feature film.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you need to keep their attention the whole way through. You need a proper story arc.
I was working on Wolfwalkers at the time that the script was being developed, and what I really loved about it was that we kept coming back to the same sort of thing we would have done for any of our features, the same kind of core thing, thinking about kids. And there's a Ukrainian version released now because it's kind of a refugee story in a way, and it's a climate refugee story, which is really relevant in a very gentle way for little kids. So I was really happy that those kind of themes were being worked into it and creating a proper overarching narrative for a feature film and not just an extended episode. So yeah, I remember that the early development period, realizing that there was some things that young kids of that age would appreciate or would need to know about, considering the state of the world today. So
yeah, a lot of kids are discovering there's lots of new kids coming into their schools from different places, and sometimes those kids don't really didn't really like that they had to leave their home, and now they're in a new home.
Yeah.
And Jeremy brought a lot to it too, because he lived in a home where they fostered a lot of children, and Jeremy was in the home, and he kind of latched on to that as the story that he knew what it's like for kids to come into a new place and have to settle in, and so that's kind of what it's about. It's the new friends or new puffins that get blown onto their island and have to settle
because of climate change, which is very gently alluded to, But that's the generation that watch Puffin Rock now. Today's 5-year-olds, they're going to have to live with people who are literally climate refugees. So it's kind of just seeding it in there.
Once again, all that sort of sustainability and environmental, it's all there. And of course, people like me, it was very useful to learn about the importance of honesty, which I learned from watching the film.
Very good.
Thank you.
You learned that.
It's a late lesson for me, but and those great. You've got Marvin the Otter there and Diggy Dig Dig, which I would never be able to listen to. It's almost like a little sort of tune, isn't it? Every time he says Diggy Dig Dig, it kind of is endearing, but kind of slightly annoying at the same time.
Very proud that there's a little egg, and it hatches at the end. And baby Lala Puffin is my granddaughter. Oh, sorry for ruining the ending. Baby Lala is my granddaughter doing the voice. So I'm very proud of her. She was so funny at the premiere, actually, because she was signing autographs. And then she turned to my wife and said, "Granny, you signed them for me. I'm tired." Prima donna at 5.
I love the fact that the voicing is done so, like the cat in... which is you used a real cat to voice.
Vagabond.
Yeah, exactly.
Sound designer's cat, Denise.
And it's got its own IMDb page.
Yeah, Denise de Vondelroy or something. She's got a very posh name. She's a very posh cat. I think she might be gone by now, but back then she was the sound designer's cat, Yeah, I mean, we're more and more leaning into it over the years. Like, it was always kind of the thing that set us apart, and we always talked about how it's kind of timeless. It doesn't age in the same way that CG kind of is always improving. So like the first CG stuff that knocked our socks off in the 90s now looks kind of dated, whereas hand-drawn animation from the 1930s and 40s still looks really fresh and relevant. And when you look at something like Bambi, it's quite painterly. It's using the language of painting and drawing. So we want to keep going with that, keep using that. There's thousands of years of human history expressing ourselves through painting and drawing. So there's a whole visual language that hand-drawn animation can tap into that other mediums have to kind of, work around to try and get that. Even the stuff we quoted like Spider-Verse and everything, it's much more a kind of bolted on afterwards, but we're doing it from the ground up. So we tell the stories with drawings, and the way we draw is part of how we tell the stories, so it's very organic, I think, and we just like drawing. I mean, I think it was a commitment as well to just wanting to spend our days drawing rather than anything else.
Well, you always talked about Eddie Lennon saying you need to take the stories and renew them for a new generation.
That was great. Yeah, Eddie Lennon is the kind of inspiration for the great Shanachie, the great storyteller in Song of the Sea, because he said it used to be on TV when I was a kid, the 10-minute tales. He'd tell the old Irish stories, but he mixes them all up. He keeps them alive by mixing them up, and he says that's the nature of them. They're an oral tradition. They're not like a gospel, and it's the only way. So he'll mix up characters, and he says they're ours to retell, and he retells them almost differently for different audiences and stuff. And so that he's like one of the old traditional spoken storytellers, and I felt like that way back around 2001. He visited the studio and we went for lunch. And when he said that to me, that kind of felt like, oh, there's permission to kind of find my way to tell the story. And then someone else might tell the same story and have a different take on it or whatever. All the trilogy have an Irish language version, and the Irish language broadcaster, T.G. Cahir, were often our kind of anchor broadcaster in Ireland, but internationally it's pretty limited, but it's always kind of have a little bit threaded in all the way through, at least the Irish folklore tree. I don't think anyone speaks Irish in the Breadwinner or my father.
There is an Irish version of,
is there?
The Breadwinner, yeah. So, and with the Cooling Dulach, the short film that you're referring to, that was based on the story by a guy living in the west of Ireland called Jackie McDonough, and but there's a Hiberno way of speaking anyway. Like even when a character speaks in Wolfwalkers, for example, even the way that the sentence is structured, even if they're speaking English, they're using they're structuring their sentence in a different way. We use it in and out and throughout. We also use silence, and we also we obviously use English as well, and we use music. I suppose they're all kind of methods of communication. As to whether we would do a full feature in Irish, well, yeah,
why not? No reason. I remember one of the first jobs, going back to the early days of the studio, one of the very first jobs we did was we illustrated all the school books for the Irish language syllabus for the Gael School, the Irish speaking schools. So there's kind of a connection there going back to the start of the studio. But yeah, in a way you're working for an international audience, so it's kind of it's important to keep it there, but it's not the main.
We're very happy that now Puff and Rock will have its Ukrainian version.
Yeah, that's
which
cool.
will come out. So for Ukrainian kids in Ireland to see, or other Ukrainian kids anywhere to watch it in their language in these countries, in our countries here. Yeah.
You've taken my final question. Let's do no. So because you have got a few that are announced, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm developing a feature I can talk a little bit about the friendship between Irish people and Choctaw Nation of Native Americans, going all the way back to 1840s. It's really interesting, and it kind of came up during the pandemic. There was a fundraiser for Navajo and Hopi people, and they were wondering why was there so much money coming in from Ireland, and it was because there was this like cultural memory and ongoing celebration of that connection. Going back to a gift that the Choctaw Nation sent some money to Ireland during the famine when they heard what was happening in Ireland was so similar to what happened to them during the Trail of Tears, and that kind of sparked this kind of exchange and kind of commonality. And there's like, I visited like the Durant, which is the capital of the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma, and they in their cultural centre they had a whole room about the connection between Ireland and the Choctaw Nation, and loads of connections. The town Nora's from, Middleton in Cork, has a statue of a famine bowl, but it's made from silver eagle feathers. It's huge, and it's called Kindred Spirits. It's just because it celebrates the similarities that you mightn't think of. So that's the inspiration for the next feature, yeah.
But before that, Louise Bagnall, who
All about me.
made that gorgeous film Late Afternoon, which was screened yesterday. She's making a film called Julian about a little boy growing up in New York. He's of Afro-Caribbean descent, and he just is a really wonderful, creative, gorgeous young child who wants to be himself, and he's plunked with his granny for a couple of weeks, and they really don't hit it off, I guess, to start with. It's a really beautiful story.
He wants to be a mermaid.
Yeah, he
wants to be a
go to the
mermaid.
parade
Yeah.
in Brooklyn, which is I was at with Louise, which is fabulous. This great mermaid parade in Brooklyn where everybody dresses up in all kinds of gear and they parade down to the sea, which is wonderful. So there's a lovely book called Julian as a Mermaid, and that's what it's based on. And I have to thank you for the shorts program because we were so emotional watching that earlier on.
Yeah, it was
And
fascinating,
all
wasn't
this,
it?
all
Couldn't
this
sleep
weekend.
last night. All the memories are kicked up. Every
Yeah.
frame has memories in it.
Yeah.
That's what the 25th anniversary is all about, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah.
Having that opportunity to reflect and
We've been
you know,
crying in the seats there, constantly. God, I remember that. I remember when we were doing that, getting very emotional, and having so many people come out and watch our stuff. And
Do you ever put Easter eggs in your films from previous
If you look
films?
closely in Song of the Sea, Aisling from The Secret of Kells is on the bus with all the kids who are dressed up for Halloween. And then if you look in Wolfwalkers, when Maeve is going through Robin's pockets, she pulls out the eye of Colin Kill from Secret of Kells.
There's caricatures, right, as well, in a lot
Oh
of them
yeah,
as well.
everyone's in there, especially in Wolfwalkers. Federico Pervano was one of the main character designers, and he had great fun because we gave him all the crowds, which people usually don't want to do, but he had so much fun because he put caricatures of us all in the crowds multiple times in different hilarious ways.
And actually, we got to say it when the Irish language, we have done a couple of 2 seasons of like all Irish language music videos, which are interesting. And I'm trying to figure out where you can catch them. You can catch them probably in different.
There's a DVD of them both.
Yes, yeah, you can,
Probably
and
the
they're
best
great.
chance you
And
have.
there were another opportunity for lots of directors to do these, basically do like kind of music videos based on old Irish songs that are reinterpreted by these amazing musicians. And we used to have this. We had this gig where all the singers came down, and Keela would play, and they'd put the animation behind them, and it's great fun.
It's a lovely way to keep the traditional songs alive again.
Yeah.
And, yeah,
Haven't
it was a
seen
nice.
those.
It was like a
Something
series of
to
short.
There,
films.
there's one called Coolon Chi and Anamanaura. Anamanaura was the
Tubber
first one. Or Tubber and Kiol. Yes.
Anyway,
Sorry, Tubber.
we're on the website. You can buy them on the website.
Right.
Yeah, no, animation is animation. If you keep drawing, that's the main thing, because sometimes people who either work in rig animation or in 3D, they can lose the ability to draw as well as they could if they had continued on just drawing daily. So, I mean, I think fear no art, you know, do if you need to, and again, like I suppose that the lesson of our 25 years is, you know, sometimes we were working in development, but we were making a commercial at the same time. We always had to be realistic about how we could bring in a check at the end of the week. So even now, you know, if it all fell away tomorrow, I'm sure I would have to go and learn some skills that maybe wouldn't be that close to my heart. I think if you just fear no art but keep drawing, you know, animation is it's about performance, it's about physics, it's about expression. It's about understanding what it is that makes, you know, a human or an animal. You know, it's the ability to observe that and then, you know, let that work through your hand, whether it's with a mouse or you know, but on a Cintiq or whatever. So I would say, yeah, just keep drawing though.
I have a few friends who transitioned from being like top hand drawn animators to being CG animators, and they often like start out just doing a really rough line test, like a rough hand drawn pass first, and then go back and animate. So they kind of keep it part of their process. There's a guy called Jason Ryan who has a lot of tutorials online. He went to Ballyfermot as well, and he shows how, you know, it's like tutorials for hand drawn animators to use CG. You know, well, that's going back a few years. But
A lot of the
presumably still
Pixar guys do sculptures and animating
Yeah.
and do a lot of that early work as well, don't they?
And a lot of our friends who went into CGI now love the CGI, and maybe might have been reluctant at first, but now love
Yeah.
what they're doing, love the process. Because I mean, it's also there's part of that that really has its own. You just try to learn to love the bits of it you like and get into it that way, and because there's a lot to love about CGI.
Okay.
Well, we know a lot of really great Mexican directors, and they're fantastic
Right.
Mexican studios. Yeah, and I guess we were always looking, you know, for cultural collaborations. You know, I think the most interesting things happen when cultures collide or where they cross over and people are inspired by each other's worlds. I think that's where, you know, that's where people are most interested in each other. You know, where you're similar, where you're different. So we certainly look for
Yeah,
collaboration.
I mean, we were kind of developing the Choctaw story with that in mind, and then realizing that Irish people have sort of had connections. So I suppose the way in for us as Irish people would be to talk about where Irish characters might have encountered characters from other cultures, and you know, there's a wealth of stuff that we could dive into. But generally speaking, the second part of your question, I think I was talking about it earlier. I think you need to kind of look at the the folklore and find what's the little nugget that you feel resonates for you, that maybe kept that story being told and retold and retold. And then that's the little gem, I suppose, at the center of the folktale, that it can help you kind of find a theme and find a focus for when you're adapting it to tell your like a wider story. Because sometimes folktales can be a little bit like just like a funny little story, you know, and then other times they can have a lot of depth and resonance, and sometimes they're getting closer to mythology, and sometimes they're getting closer to just like a yarn, you know, and you kind of need to look at them and see. And like Eddie Lenihan says, you can kind of go on a shopping trip and take parts from it and sort of retell it, you know.
Well, that is all we have time for, I'm afraid. I just want to say that you know, it's such a thrill to have had such kind of you know, a lot of generosity and in terms of your time and your thoughtful answers to the questions today, and for being here over the weekend. We're so thrilled to have had the opportunity here at the BFI to kick off your 25th anniversary year.
Thanks
and,
to you, Justin.
A big thank you to the three of you. Thank you so much for being here.